In most cases, love will lead us to happiness, and we are willing to do anything for the one we love. And sometimes, following your heart can lead into darkness.
It looked like a professional hit. They were really, trying to get the job done.
The house was ransacked, items were everywhere, and the gun was missing. This case opened up a lot of eyes in the community. Once inside the darkness, it can be hard to find a way out. July 30th, 2009. It's a warm, rainy summer night in Scranton, Pennsylvania.
I think it's a relatively small town in a big city atmosphere to a degree. And I think for the most part, Scranton sort of takes all of those influences, both good and bad.
On this Wednesday night, the town is mostly quiet, until a woman calls police to report that a man has been struck by a car on a rural road just outside the city.
There were two young women, and they notice a body and immediately call 911.
I was the on-call criminal investigator. They told me where the incident occurred, Ransom, Pennsylvania, which is right outside of the city. When I got there were other vehicles there were other units. The forensic services guys were already there. There was probably patrol troopers there, so it was lit up pretty well.
First responders tell McGurran that this is no auto accident. It's a murder scene. First officers on the scene found that the body had been shot multiple times. Detectives and crime scene techs work quickly to secure the area, but the intense rain makes evidence collection difficult.
You can see evidence just being washed down the road. There wasn't spatter, there was just blood just being washed down the road.
Anytime there's weather on a situation when you're outside, you're sort of running against the clock and running just against the elements in terms of preserving anything that's there. So it's, work smart and work quick so that you preserve as much of that as possible.
The victim is a Hispanic male who appears to be in his late 20s or early 30s. The coroner examines the body and confirms numerous gunshot wounds. Nearby, investigators locate and collect shell casings. They ultimately find a dozen shell casings. 7 are from a .40 caliber weapon, and the other 5 are from a 9mm.
From an investigative standpoint, once you see multiple types of shell casings, the initial thought is that there's multiple perpetrators. I think we also were able to tell pretty quickly from the number of wounds, the angle of wounds, and different things that we were dealing with more than one shooter.
The presence of a .40 caliber casing is unusual. That caliber is relatively rare.
I kind of said to myself, that's what we carried at the time. The Pennsylvania State Police were carrying .40 caliber weapons, and not a lot of other people were.
Investigators ask themselves, could a state trooper be involved in the shooting? Detectives search the victim's pockets and find a wallet containing a Pennsylvania state identification card issued to Alan Fernandez, a 29-year-old male.
He was currently residing in Hazleton at the MNSEC unit, which is a halfway house. So he had just been released from some kind of a correctional facility.
Hazleton is almost an hour south of Spread, and there's no car in the area where the body was found. So presumably someone drove him there from Hazleton.
There was nothing really around. There wasn't a store or a gasoline station that would bring anybody to that general area. You were either taken there, left there, or mistakenly wound up there.
No cell phone is found on Fernandez's body, but police do find a receipt for a burner phone purchased earlier that day.
We found a cell phone receipt. He bought it at a Walmart in Hazleton.
Cell phones are extremely important sources for information for police. If police can get access to the phone records, then they can find out who Fernandez had contact with earlier that day. Obtaining the cell phone records will take time. Meanwhile, the two women who found the body provide police with one additional clue. They saw a vehicle leaving the trail as they pulled in. They believe the vehicle was light in color, possibly white or silver. The only other details that they could remember is that it had extremely bright headlights. So as far as leads go, it wasn't much. Fernandez's body is taken to the morgue for an autopsy. As detectives try to learn everything they can about his life, the vast majority of murders are committed by someone who knows the victim. So investigators concentrated on identifying everyone in his inner circle. They begin by talking to some other people who live with Alan at the halfway house in Hazleton.
I did interview several of the residents there.
Detectives then speak with Fernandez's family, who tells them that he was previously affiliated with a local criminal organization, but was working to turn his life around and move away from negative influences.
There was a certain and very firm belief that Mr. Fernandez was moving forward in a positive direction and distancing himself, disconnecting from those things, those influences which would have caused him difficulty in the past.
They were hopeful that he had turned things around and would become a productive member of society.
But the brutal way in which Fernandez has been killed suggests he may have been unable to leave his past behind.
There certainly wasn't accidental with 12 gunshot wounds. It certainly didn't appear to be a robbery gone bad, again, based on the location. There was no connection that would have initially put the victim in that spot.
Detectives would soon discover that this murder has ties to a web of other crimes.
He was pointing fingers. He didn't know, but he more or less said they could do this.
Pennsylvania State Police investigators believe the murder of Alan Fernandez may be connected to his past involvement with dangerous associates. While detectives seem to think that they have uncovered a possible motive for his murder, they still don't have any suspects, or even an explanation to how he got from his halfway house in Hazleton to Scranton. Detectives do have one clue. Fernandez bought a burner phone at a Walmart in Hazleton less than 8 hours before he was murdered.
We had video from the Walmart, him buying the cell phone. We were trying to see if he was with anybody.
But the video shows that Fernandez was checking out alone. The phone was not found with Fernandez's buying, but the receipt does include the phone number that the burner phone was using. And police are able to subpoena the phone records and calls made and received by Alan Fernandez. The phone is only active for 7 hours leading up to Fernandez's death, and most of the calls he made and received come from the same 2 cell phone numbers. Police find that those 2 phone numbers belong to a middle-aged woman, Barbara Future, and her 39-year-old boyfriend, Robert Fisher. Detectives dig into their backgrounds and don't find any criminal history. They don't seem like the people that will be involved in a brutal murder.
We like to bring them back to our barracks, to an interview room, to find out what they know about this.
So investigators talk to Mr. Fisher, investigators talk to Barbara Future, and, begin the process of trying to kind of peel back the layers of what was happening.
Barbara Future tells detectives that she did not know Alan Fernandez and had never spoken to him.
She didn't know anything about it. She didn't know. She never went to Hazleton. She didn't know who had her phone.
The problem was, records show that her phone called Fernandez's phone that evening and had received a call from him also that evening. She basically told police that she could not explain how the phone records included her phone number. She just denied having anything to do with it. Her boyfriend, Robert Fisher, gives police a different explanation.
Robert Fisher said pretty quickly that he wasn't using the phone on that night in question, but he was able to give us the names of other people that had access to the phone.
That list includes 2 of Barbara Future's sons, 26-year-old Jeff Future and 18-year-old Tony Future.
He was pointing fingers at Tony and Jeff, that his phone disappeared, and then he found it out in the front yard the next day of the night of the incident. He didn't say, I know they went down there and shot this guy. He didn't know, but he more or less said they could do this. He thought they were bad guys. He thought they were of the criminal element.
But as detectives look into Fisher's background, they begin to wonder if he's trying to deflect heat from himself.
He was nervous. Rob was from the Philadelphia area, and he had a drinking problem, and he had done prison time, but it was for so many retail thefts. He was stealing booze, or he was stealing something he could sell for alcohol.
Fisher didn't have any gang ties, but while the shooting looked like it could be a gang-related hit, it's not impossible that there could have been another motive. So Fisher remained on the radar. That begins to change as detectives learn more about Barbara Future's two sons, Jeff and Tony. Barbara Future had an apartment in the projects where her boyfriend and her two sons stayed, but detectives started to go door to door in the neighborhood asking about Jeff and Tony. They learned some troubling things.
Jeff Future had a pretty significant criminal history already for, being a relatively young man.
Jeff had just gotten out of prison a few weeks earlier. Detectives also hear talk that Jeff's younger brother Tony, who is just 18 years old, might be affiliated with street life.
Tony Future had been a person of interest in some other crimes that had occurred previous to the Alan Fernandez homicide.
About a month before the Alan Fernandez murder, there was a drive-by shooting in Scranton, and at least one eyewitness placed Tony Future at the scene. While Jeff Future has a well-known criminal past, his brother Tony seems more grounded. Tony's a recent high school graduate. He played on the football team with his good friend Christian Kenyon. He also had a girlfriend, Jasmine Rivera, who he dated off and on for a couple of years.
When you look at Tony Future, Christian Kenyon, Jasmine Rivera on paper, they're young kids with seemingly the whole world in front of them. They were in high school. They were playing sports. There was extracurricular activities. Jasmine and Tony, they shared a young child. I think it was Tony was the child's name. And they were seemingly going to stay together. They were in what they believed to be a long-term relationship.
Despite this, detectives can't help believing that both of the brothers are involved in the murder.
Both Jeff and Tony Future is starting to look like good potential suspects. Jeff and Tony had access to the phones that made contact with Alan the night he was killed.
But police are going to need more evidence if they're going to tie them to the murder.
So detectives turn to the information they've recovered from Alan Fernandez's burner phone.
The receipt found in Fernandez's wallet shows that he purchased the prepaid phone at 6:17 p.m. on July 29, 2009, less than 7 hours before he was killed. At 7:43 p.m., about an hour and a half after he purchased the phone, Fernandez received a call from Barbara Future's cell phone.
Fernandez received another call from that phone about 90 minutes later. And an hour later, he received several more phone calls from Robert Fisher's phone.
Investigators asked the FBI to help them determine the locations of all three phones at the time of the calls. And what they uncover could be the breakthrough they've been searching for.
Detectives investigating the murder of Alan Fernandez are concentrating on two brothers, Jeff and Tony Future. Detectives believe Jeff and Tony Future likely used cell phones belonging to their mother and her boyfriend to talk with Fernandez on the night of his murder. Cell phone records show that the phone has only been active for several hours, and shortly after it was purchased, Fernandez received a call from Barbara Future's cell phone. And hours later, multiple calls from Robert Fisher's phone. Detectives had reached out to the FBI for assistance in triangulating the locations of all the cell phones involved. The FBI determines that when these calls were placed, the phones registered to Barbara Future and Robert Fisher were pinging towers in Scranton. Alan Fernandez's phone was pinging towers in Hazleton, over 40 miles south. That soon changes, but Robert Fisher's phone calls Alan Fernandez at 10:20 p.m. It begins hitting cell towers headed south of Scranton. By the time the final call is made at 11 p.m., Fisher's phone is in Hazleton, which is where Fernandez is. Between 11:30 and 11:40 p.m., Fernandez receives 3 calls from other cell phones. At that time, his phone is hitting cell towers north of Hazleton, which suggests he is heading north. Fernandez's phone is not the only one headed north, towards Scranton. The FBI's analysis shows that the phones belonging to Barbara Future and Robert Fisher is also hitting the same towers, so it appears they're all moving north, moving in tandem. The FBI believed that this showed all 3 cell phones were likely in the same car, driving up the highway from Hazleton to Scranton. The FBI analysis presents compelling evidence that whoever used those phones was likely involved in Fernandez's death. One of the biggest questions that detectives had was, how did Alan Fernandez get from Hazleton to Scranton? Now it looked like they had their answer. Detectives feel it's time to bring the brothers in for questioning and confront them with the phone evidence. But the move backfires. Jeff and Tony Future denies any involvement in the murder. They admit to using the phones. They even admit to driving down to Hazleton and picking Fernandez up. They say they didn't shoot him. They claim that someone asked him to do them a favor and pick up Fernandez and bring him back to Scranton. They do it and drop Fernandez off in a house in the projects, and they never see him again. Detectives really don't believe what the brothers are saying, but the problem is they don't have any evidence to contradict it and can't hold him. The phone evidence may put them with Alan Fernandez, but it doesn't show that they killed them. Detectives release the brothers, but also let them know they are still on their radar.
We were pressing these guys. We were appearing in places a lot and just, hey, what are you hearing anything new? We knew they were suspects, and we were just hoping maybe that they would eventually like, all right, here's what I know.
Then, almost 3 weeks after the murder, detectives finally get a break. It comes not from the brothers, but from their mother's boyfriend, Robert Fisher.
I was calling Fisher a lot, and every time I talked to him, I felt like I got a little more from him. And then he started calling us because he was getting a little nervous. Barb was calling him a rat, and he was getting a little antsy. He was scared.
Fisher says one day when he was at Barb's house, Tony's friend Christian Kenyon and his girlfriend Jasmine Rivera were there, and he overheard part of their conversation.
He had heard Jasmine and I think Christian Kenyon bragging or talking about other crimes that they had been involved in.
They discussed 2 crimes in particular, a robbery of a Dunkin' Donuts store and a home burglary in a nearby county.
In early July, there was a burglary at a house in Peckville, which again is in Lackawanna County. That residence happened to belong to a Pennsylvania state trooper. And there were items of jewelry taken, I think a camera or a camcorder, as well as a weapon. In addition, in early July, there was the robbery of Dunkin' Donuts on Music Street in Scranton. And that was a robbery by gunpoint.
Could these crimes be connected to the Alan Fernandez murder? Detectives need to know.
My partner, who was a vice officer at the time, we were on the same page. We said, let's follow up on this burglary. Let's see what was taken.
They obtained the case file, and they learned that a weapon, a handgun, was indeed taken from the trooper's home. And it's not just any weapon. It's the trooper's .40 caliber Beretta. That's the same caliber of one of the weapons used in the Fernandez murder. So now the detectives are very optimistic that they're onto something. Little did investigators realize that the key to solving the case would lie in an unexpected player. The investigation into the murder of Alan Fernandez has stalled, but a breakthrough emerges when detectives receive a tip. The girlfriend of one of their prime suspects has been bragging about her involvement in other crimes, potentially unraveling new leads. Detectives are taking a hard look at Jeff and Tony Future, and now they learn that Tony's girlfriend Jasmine Rivera is talking about the burglary of a state trooper's home 3 weeks before the Fernandez murder. July 8, 2009, Oliphant Borough. Shortly after 5 p.m., Pennsylvania State Trooper Timothy Gilhooly finishes his shift and arrives home. As he walks up the sidewalk, he notices that the front door is wide open, and he immediately knows that something is wrong. She rushes inside and finds that his house has been ransacked. Items are everywhere. The cabinets are opened and rifled through. Dresser drawers are all empty. The most disconcerting thing is that a small gun safe, which contains a service weapon, is gone. The trooper reports the burglary to the local police department, who immediately begins an investigation. Detectives go door to door through the neighborhood, looking for potential witnesses. They find an elderly woman who lives a couple of doors down, and she says she saw 3 young women running out of the trooper's house earlier that morning. The witness says that one of the women, a light-skinned Hispanic, was in such a hurry that she nearly runs her over. She gives her some story about looking for her job, then climbs into a minivan that appears to be driven by a black male and drives off. The witness is able to remember enough details about the women to help police create a composite sketch, which is distributed to the media. The burglary in sketch is publicized, but police weren't able to identify a suspect. Detectives wonder if Jasmine Rivera is the burglar who nearly collided with the elderly woman outside Trooper Gilhooly's home.
I'm like, oh man, it's all coming together. Let's do a photo lineup. So the officer in Elephant puts together a lineup. This was his case.
He calls that elderly witness and asks if she remembers the woman that she ran into. The woman agrees to help any way that she can. So the police put a picture of Jasmine Rivera, an array of other photos, and show it to the witness.
She didn't even hesitate. 1 second, bam, that's her. She pointed right to Jasmine.
The eyewitness identification is enough for detectives to get a search warrant for Jasmine Rivera's home.
Once we got there, we took her out of there. She wasn't cooperative. She didn't say, okay, here it is. We had to search the house. We found a lot of the described stolen merchandise from the trooper's house. I remember because it stood out. There was dolphin earrings, not the gun. The gun was not there.
They bring Jasmine to the barracks for questioning. She denies everything and says that she wasn't involved in any burglary, but they present her with evidence found in her home, and eventually she admits being involved. Robert Fisher had told police that Jasmine Rivera had bragged about a robbery of a Dunkin' Donuts, so they ask her about it, and she confesses to being involved in that crime too. July 13, 2009. Scranton police receive a 911 call from an employee at a Dunkin' Donuts who says the store has been held up by a pair of armed robbers. Officers arrive to interview the 2 women who were working the overnight shift. One of the women tells detectives that just a few minutes after 1 a.m., she was in the back of the store by the freezer area where she heard some noises coming from outside of the rear exit door. She was startled and immediately closed the door, so she quickly walks to the front of the store to warn her coworker about what she had seen. When she got to the front counter, 2 masked suspects entered the store through the front door.
They were brazen. They were confident. They were cocky. They knew where everything was. They went directly to where they needed to be.
The woman said one of the robbers walked to the kitchen area and attempted to access the lot manager's office. The other robber collected money from the registers, then used a crowbar to pry open the manager's office. The 2 robbers went to a toolbox, which is where the manager kept the money deposit bags, and removed all of them. They then put the 2 employees in the bathroom and fled. The robbers make off with over $1,600 in cash. The employees can only give police vague descriptions. They both wore gloves and had almost all their skin covered, so it was hard to determine their race. The robbery is captured on store surveillance video. When detectives examine it, they believe one of the robbers may be a woman. Detectives ask the store manager and other employees to take a look at the video. They say that the robbers seem to know the procedures of the store. In particular, this one. An outsider wouldn't know that the money bags are kept in a toolbox in a manager's office. The store managers also ask about Rivera, and she says that she is the only employee that she would consider a potential suspect in the robbery. The manager also said Jasmine had a boyfriend named Tony who drove a white minivan. Now, a month later, Jasmine admits to detectives that she was involved in the Dunkin' Donuts robbery.
Jasmine Rivera had lost her job there, and whether she felt slighted or somehow hurt by the fact that she no longer had a job, and that was at least one of the motivations.
She had worked there and was involved in sort of planning and how to execute that. I don't think Jasmine Rivera never presented in a way that she was under duress or forced to do something. I think she wanted to be considered as serious and as a player.
The pieces are starting to align as the police are closing in on their suspects, and a new development is set to crack the case wide open. Jasmine Rivera's confession to her roles in 2 crimes. Detectives believe they are closing in on the killers of Alan Fernandez. A witness picked Jasmine out of a phone lineup in connection with the robbery of a state trooper's home. After authorities searched her home and found some of the missing items, they brought Jasmine in for questioning. She admitted to the crimes, adding that Tony Future and Christian Kenyon were also involved.
She was Tony's girlfriend, and she was friends with Kenyon. They were all friends.
Jasmine is in love with Tony, and he is a father to her child, so she was willing to do whatever was necessary to support her man. They had a strong bond, and she was going to back him up.
I know she had a child from a previous relationship, I believe. And Tony took this kid in, he took care of her.
They were teenagers that had this Bonnie and Clyde thing going on, and were navigating the world like partners in crime. Once he joined a gang, she naturally followed his lead. She wanted to prove her loyalty. Investigators press Jasmine about the gun that's still missing from the robbery at the state trooper's home. She reluctantly admits that the gun they used to rob the Dunkin' Donuts is the same gun that they stole from the trooper's home. Detectives want to know where that gun is now.
We laid it on her. Where's the weapon? It was used in a homicide. At that time, I gave it to Tony. She burglarized the house with 2 other individuals. Tony was the driver.
She did reveal that she had turned it over to Tony Future, and that she was aware of the homicide. She was not a participant in the killing of Mr. Fernandez, but she was aware of it.
Detectives are already thinking that Tony and his brother Jeff were already involved. And now they finally have a nexus as to how they could have gotten the .40 caliber gun. Detectives immediately pick up Jeff Future and Tony Future for the second time. They also pick up Christian Kenyon and bring them to the state police barracks for questioning. All 3 suspects initially deny any involvement in the murder.
None of them confessed immediately or were willing to give up information on the other. It had sort of been their MO was to not cooperate with the police and, deny until faced with the obvious. Jeff Future was the oldest and I think the most experienced in terms of dealing with police officers, so he didn't initially give up much, even when faced with what investigators believed was pretty rock-solid evidence.
But Jeff Future's 18-year-old brother, Tony, is not as successful in stonewalling detectives. It was difficult for Tony to deny everything, because his girlfriend Jasmine had already admitted that he was involved in the robbery of the trooper's home and the Dunkin' Donuts robbery. Plus, she told them that she had given him the gun.
He gave himself up. But he didn't want to implicate anybody else. Eventually, the truth came out. It was like, you can't do it halfway. You got to tell us the real truth. And he did. But in the beginning, he was going to take the heat for it.
Tony Future admits the plan to kill Alan Fernandez originated with his brother, Jeff.
Jeff was very clearly the leader of this particular set in Scranton, Pennsylvania. And I think he was ultimately the one that made the call that he was going to be murdered, as well as the fact that all 3 of them were going to do it so that ideally none of them would ever rat on the other ones, because you'd be ratting on yourselves.
The perception was Alan Fernandez was jumping sets, was moving from sets in a manner, in a way that folks that were affiliated with Jeffrey Future disliked. They thought that was problematic, and that was the motivator why he needed to be murdered.
Someone ordered a hit on him.
So they made an arrangement to pick him up in Hazleton. The arrangements are made using cell phones belonging to Barbara Future and Robert Fisher. Without those cell phone records and the analysis of their locations through pinging, Jeff and Tony Future might never become suspects.
Mr. Future and Mr. Kenyon picked up Mr. Fernandez, took him back to Snake Road. One of the gentlemen stated that they needed to use the bathroom, and the vehicle stopped intentionally so that someone could use the bathroom, go in the woods there.
They got him out of the vehicle, and then they had him at gunpoint and shot him 12 times.
Detectives used Tony Future's confession to force a confession from his brother Jeff, as well as their friend, Christian Kenyon.
Christian wasn't very cooperative either. He didn't want to talk. We were in there for a while. We gave him the same angle that we used with Jeff and Tony, told him what we knew, and he eventually admitted to it.
Tony told detectives that Kenyon was the one that got rid of the guns, which investigators would need to recover as evidence.
We said, hey, Christian, a kid finds these guns, you want another body in your hands. He gave it up. He brought us to a small wooded patch that was in West Scranton, right near the high school. He brought us to a 5-gallon bucket where 2 9mm and the .40 caliber were inside the bucket, buried under some rocks.
It had been hidden or attempted to be hidden. And I think but for knowing it was there, I don't know that it would have been located by police without Christian's direction.
Jeff Future, Tony Future, and Christian Kenyon are arrested and charged with first-degree murder and various other crimes. Jasmine Rivera is arrested and charged with burglary and robbery. The community is shocked by the depravity of the crimes.
We're talking about juveniles. I mean, kids that played on the local high school football team accused of murder in such a heinous way. I think it piques people's interest, but I also think it makes them want to figure out why.
With all confessions in hand, prosecutors think the case is wrapped up, but one defendant is about to throw a curveball. He admitted to being there and firing shots, but insists that he didn't kill Fernandez, and he wanted his day in court. Detectives have obtained confessions from Jeff and Tony Future, Christian Kenyon, and Jasmine Rivera. Their admissions to a series of brazen crimes shocks the close-knit community in Scranton, Pennsylvania.
I think a crime like this, and then when you couple it with, 3 or 4, really egregious, heinous crimes, it piques people's interest and makes them want to fix it to make sure we don't become the type of community where this becomes second nature.
One of the most shocking things about this case were their ages. Jeff Future, who was 26, was the only real adult. Tony was 18 and had just finished high school, while Christian Kenyon and Jasmine Rivera were both 17 and still in school. On January 19, 2010, Jeffrey Future pleads guilty to first-degree murder and is sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
Jeff Future agreed to plead guilty if the death penalty was taken off the table. So that was removed from him. Part of Jeff's ultimate agreement was also that Tony Future would not face the death penalty for his involvement.
Tony Future pleads guilty to third-degree murder, conspiracy to commit burglary, and conspiracy to commit robbery, and is sentenced to 35 to 70 years in prison. Christian Kenyon, despite showing police where he had hidden the guns, shocked everyone when he decides to take his case to trial.
Kenyon was a juvenile at the time. Maybe that's why he took a trial, thinking he was going to get, a little more leniency.
Christian claimed that the murder of Alan Fernandez was committed by Jeff and Tony Future. He admitted that he was there and fired shots at Alan Fernandez, but claims that he didn't fire the shots that killed him. What he didn't realize is that it doesn't matter who actually fired the shots that killed Fernandez, which would be almost impossible to determine anyway. All three were involved in the plot. All three fired guns at the victims. They were equally guilty. Jasmine Rivera, in exchange for leniency in her sentencing, agrees to testify against Kenyon. She talked about Kenyon's involvement and described his role in the Dunkin' Donuts robbery. In her testimony, she also provides insight into her own criminal behavior. Her and Tony began dating in 2007, 2 years before the crimes. When she noticed Tony falling under the influence of his brother Jeff, she urged him not to become involved.
She was a smart girl. She knew it was bad to get themselves into that situation. She knew they were like, this is no good. She told Tony that.
But over time, Jasmine, who doesn't have any other real family, eventually found herself being sucked into the lifestyle by her man.
She didn't have a good family life because she was still a high school student living in the projects on her own. Her family, I remember her saying at one point, was Tony. They were looking out for each other, and she had always been at Barb Future's residence. So the family life wasn't the best.
Jasmine soon finds herself completely devoted to her man and their life of crime.
I don't think Jasmine Rivera ever necessarily saw herself as, just the woman who stayed behind and took care of the kid. She was going to be someone who was going to be involved in it. And quite frankly, I think she was a bit of a decision maker.
She was the one who wanted to rob the Dunkin' Donuts because she felt like they disrespected her. She was the one who stole the trooper's gun and gave it to her boyfriend, who used it in a cold-blooded murder. Thanks in part to Jasmine Rivera's testimony, Christian Kenyon is convicted of first-degree murder and armed robbery, and is ultimately sentenced to 35 years to life in prison. Rivera pleads guilty to burglary and robbery charges, and is sentenced to 34 months to 10 years in prison.
I think Jasmine, unfortunately, is sort of indicative of what we see a lot of young women that are forced to maybe grow up too quickly and just make poor decisions. So I think she hopefully uses it, and other young women can use this as an example of, you can come back from things like this, but you're never going to be the same.
Her actions contributed to a murder that left a profound void in the Fernandez family's heart.
Alan Fernandez had served his time in a state prison and was trying to, I think, do the right thing. The family was obviously very upset and sad that Mr. Fernandez really wasn't going to have the chance to prove to them that he was done with that life and that he wanted to move away from that and move on.
But aligning with the wrong group of people can have terrible repercussions. When a young woman lets her heart lead instead of her head, the cost may be her freedom and future, forever altering her path.